Hello everyone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear more meaningful stories.
The rain fell softly against the windows of Richard's grand mansion, the rhythmic sound almost drowned out by the thoughts swirling in his mind. He stood by the large window, his gaze fixed on the storm outside, yet his heart felt heavier than the sky above. As one of the wealthiest men in the country, with an empire of companies, luxurious cars, and sprawling properties, Richard should have felt invincible. Yet, despite it all, he felt like a stranger in his own home. His wife, Grace, only smiled when there was money to be had, her affection always tied to his wealth. His daughter, Sophia, spent her days posting pictures of her latest designer outfits and extravagant vacations, her life a perfect reflection of the image she wanted to project online. But it was his son, Daniel, who remained a quiet observer, always close by, his presence a source of comfort Richard rarely acknowledged. Sitting at the dining table that evening, Richard watched his family in silence. Grace barely glanced his way as she picked at her food, too absorbed in the life she had come to expect. Sophia giggled at something on her phone, her attention fixed on the virtual world she inhabited. It was only Daniel who noticed his father, his concerned eyes meeting Richard's. "Dad, are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but full of genuine concern. Richard offered a small, forced smile, trying to mask the exhaustion in his eyes. "I'm fine, son," he lied. But deep inside, he was far from fine. He was tired of the shallow smiles, the endless demands, the feeling of being used for his wealth. He needed to know if his family truly cared for him, or if they were just staying because of the luxury his money afforded them. The weight of that thought settled heavily on his chest as he stared at his family, wondering if he had ever really known them at all. That evening, Richard sat at the dining table, his eyes lingering on his family as they ate in silence. The elegant chandelier above cast a soft glow over the polished table, but the warmth it should have provided felt distant, almost foreign. Grace sat across from him, her eyes fixed on her plate, not once glancing in his direction. The smile that once adorned her face when she'd first married him had long since vanished, replaced with an indifferent mask that only flickered when money was involved. Sophia, his daughter, was entirely consumed by her phone, her fingers scrolling, her giggles punctuating the silence, clearly amused by whatever the digital world had to offer. But it was Daniel, his son, who caught his gaze. Daniel, sitting quietly at the corner of the table, noticed his father's distant expression and asked, "Dad, are you okay?" His voice, simple and filled with concern, cut through the otherwise hollow atmosphere. Richard's heart ached at the sound of it. He forced a smile, one that barely reached his eyes, and said, "I'm fine, son." But even as the words left his lips, he knew they were a lie. He was far from fine. The weight of the years spent building an empire, only to watch it crumble around him, was too much. He glanced around the table, feeling the heavy isolation in the air. Grace's disinterest, Sophia's selfish world, and even Daniel's quiet concern seemed so far removed from the life he had hoped they would share. His heart felt heavy with a mixture of anger and sadness, a deep longing for something real. Tired of the fake smiles, tired of being the source of everything that kept this family afloat, Richard made a decision. He couldn't keep living like this, surrounded by people who only loved him for what he could give. He needed to know if they truly cared for him, or if they were just another part of his luxurious life that could vanish in an instant. That night, long after the house had fallen silent, Richard's mind raced with the decision he had made. He picked up the phone and dialed Michael, his trusted personal assistant. "Michael." Richard's voice was steady, though his heart pounded with an unspoken intensity. "I want you to transfer everything to the private account. Close down the companies for now. Tell everyone I'm taking a break. And most importantly, no one must know that I'm still wealthy." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, are you sure?" Michael's voice crackled with confusion. "This will shake the entire family." Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the shadows cast across the room. "That's the point," he replied calmly. "I need to know who they really are. I'm testing them." With a sigh, Michael reluctantly agreed, and they ended the call. Richard stood in front of the large window overlooking the dark, empty expanse of his estate. The weight of his decision settled on his shoulders, but there was a strange sense of clarity that he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, as the family gathered in the living room, the tension in the air was palpable. Grace walked in, her face creased with annoyance. "Why are we all gathered here so early?" she snapped, clearly irritated. Richard took a deep breath, steeling himself. "I have bad news," he began, his voice heavy with the gravity of what he was about to say. "I've lost everything. The businesses have collapsed. The banks have frozen our accounts. We have nothing left." Grace's face turned ashen. "What do you mean, nothing?" she demanded, her voice rising in disbelief. "You're joking, right?" Richard shook his head slowly, his gaze unwavering. "I wish I were. We need to leave this house today. I only have one place left we can go." Sophia's face twisted with horror. "A village? No way!" she cried. Daniel, who had been silent up until then, looked at his father with wide eyes. "Are you serious?" he asked softly, his voice a mixture of disbelief and concern. Richard nodded. "Yes, it's the only option. We're going to my late father's small house in the village." And so, in the face of overwhelming loss, Richard's family was about to embark on a journey that would force them to confront not only their material wealth, but also the true nature of their bonds. The next morning, Richard gathered his family in the living room, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Grace walked in, her frown deepening as she looked at her husband. "Why are we all here so early?" she snapped, clearly irritated at the interruption to her usual routine. Richard stood up, his posture stiff with resolve. He knew this moment would change everything. "I have bad news," he said, his voice flat, each word heavy with the truth. "I've lost everything. The business has crashed. The banks have frozen our accounts. We have nothing left." The room went eerily quiet. Grace's eyes widened, disbelief spreading across her face. She jumped to her feet, the chair scraping against the floor. "What do you mean nothing? You're joking, right?" she demanded, her voice rising in anger. Richard shook his head, his heart sinking with every passing second. "I wish I were, but it's true. We have to leave this house today. I've got one place we can go, my father's old house in the village." Sophia, who had been scrolling through her phone, shot up from her seat, her face contorting in horror. "A village? No, no way," she cried, her voice filled with panic. "This can't be happening." Richard remained calm, his tone unwavering. "We have no choice. It's the only option." He turned to Daniel, who had been sitting quietly, absorbing the weight of his words. "Are you serious, Dad?" Daniel asked softly, his voice full of disbelief. Richard nodded, his gaze steady. "Yes, it's the only way." Grace let out a sharp laugh, almost bitter, her eyes flashing with frustration. "You useless man! How could you lose everything like that?" she shouted, her words sharp and filled with contempt. Richard didn't respond. He simply turned away, walking toward the door. Daniel, ever the quiet observer, followed his father without a word, his eyes filled with a mix of concern and loyalty. "Don't worry, Dad," Daniel said softly, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "Everything will be okay." Richard forced a smile, the weight of the day's events settling into the pit of his stomach. As they packed their things, the house that had once been filled with the noise of luxury now stood silent. The mansion was no longer their home. It was a relic of a life they had lost. By evening, the mansion, once alive with maids and drivers, had fallen into an eerie silence. Richard packed the last of the bags into the small, beat-up car Michael had arranged for this plan, the car so old it barely seemed capable of making the journey. Grace, still grumbling under her breath, refused to leave without her comfort, luxury, vanity, and all the material things she felt entitled to. "I can't believe this is happening," she muttered as she threw her bags into the back seat, clearly fuming. "We've been reduced to this." Sophia, sitting in the passenger seat, kept her face glued to her phone, her eyes flicking to the screen in a vain attempt to distract herself from the madness unfolding around her. "I'm not going to survive this," she said, almost to herself, her voice tinged with disgust. Daniel, in the back seat, didn't say a word. He just stared out the window, taking in the stark contrast of the road ahead, rough, dusty, and far from the polished streets of their former life. The drive to the village was long and unforgiving. The road was bumpy, each jolt sending the car rattling like it might fall apart at any moment. Grace complained the entire way, each bump and turn earning a sharp remark from her. "This is ridiculous. I can't live like this," she shouted. Sophia didn't help matters, refusing to roll down her window. her face contorted in distaste. But Daniel, quiet, composed, and ever the observer, seemed unfazed by the discomfort. He sat in the back, a steady presence in the chaos, holding Richard's hand through the turmoil. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they arrived at the small compound. Grace's eyes widened in disbelief as she stepped out of the car and took in their surroundings. The house was tiny, with crumbling walls and a rusted iron roof. "What is this?" she cried, staring in horror at the dilapidated structure. This is... this is madness!" Sophia echoed her sentiments, wrinkling her nose at the smell in the air as she slowly stepped out. Richard stood tall, unaffected by their shock. "This is where we'll stay for now," he said simply, his tone resigned. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't even close, but it was all he had left. As he led them toward the small, crumbling house, he realized that in this moment, he was truly alone in a way he'd never been before. Grace stepped out of the car, her heels sinking into the soft earth, and her eyes widened in disbelief as she took in the surroundings. The small house stood there, humble and unassuming, its walls made of cracked mud bricks and a rusty iron roof that looked like it had seen better days. The yard was overgrown with weeds, and the faint smell of earth and sweat lingered in the air. Grace's face twisted in horror. "What is this place, Richard?" she asked, her voice thick with disgust. "Are you out of your mind? This is a nightmare." Sophia, her daughter, hesitated before opening the car door. She covered her nose with a handkerchief as she stepped out, wrinkling her face in distaste. "Oh my God, this place stinks," she muttered, the words dripping with disdain. She looked around in disbelief. This is what we've been reduced to?" Her tone was almost a mockery of the whole situation. Richard, unbothered by their reactions, stood calmly and surveyed the property. "This is my father's house," he said quietly, his voice steady. "We'll manage here for now." Grace's eyes filled with anger, her frustration bubbling over. "Manage here? After all those years living in mansions, you want to bury me in this dump?" Her voice rose with each word, her face flushed with indignation. "What kind of man are you, Richard? How could you let us fall so low?" Sophia, who had been staring at the ground, now looked up, eyes wide with disbelief. "No Wi-Fi, no air conditioning, no mirrors in the bathroom," she said, her voice tinged with panic. "How do people even live like this?" Her hand reached for her phone, but there was no signal. "How am I supposed to survive here, Daddy?" she added, her words a blend of mockery and despair. Only Daniel, his eyes calm and focused, stepped out of the car without a word. He walked around to his father's side, helping him with the bags. When Grace and Sophia continued to complain, he simply shook his head. There was no point in arguing. "We'll be okay, Dad," he said softly, giving Richard a small but reassuring smile. Richard looked at him, his heart swelling with gratitude. His son's quiet strength was the only comfort in this strange, uncomfortable place. And though Grace and Sophia's protests echoed around him, Richard knew this was the beginning of something deeper, a test of who would stand by him when everything else had fallen apart. That evening, Richard struggled to light a fire outside, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the damp wood. The flames sputtered weakly, smoke swirling into his eyes, stinging his vision. He hadn't done this in years, forgotten how to start a fire, how to use the simplest tools. His breath came in shallow bursts, frustration creeping up his spine as the match he struck failed to catch. The warmth from the fire seemed so far out of reach, just like the life he had known. Daniel, watching quietly from a distance, saw his father's struggle and stepped forward without a word. He crouched beside Richard, taking over the task with practiced ease. His fingers moved with purpose, positioning the logs and fanning the embers with a gentle but steady hand. "I used to watch the village boys do this during the holidays," Daniel said softly, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. The fire crackled to life as the flames began to grow, lighting up their faces in the growing dusk. Richard glanced at his son, a wave of gratitude washing over him. "Thank you, Daniel," he said, his voice rough. "You're the only one making this easier for me." There was a quiet strength in his son's actions, a calm that seemed to center Richard in the midst of the chaos. As the fire began to take hold, the warmth spread across the small space, offering the first sense of comfort Richard had felt since they arrived. Meanwhile, Grace sat on a nearby rock, her arms crossed, her face set in a permanent scowl. She looked down at her broken nails, cursing softly under her breath. "This is a nightmare," she muttered, her voice dripping with resentment. "No cream, no TV, no fan. God punish poverty," she added bitterly, as if the world had wronged her by forcing her into this life. Sophia, not wanting to be left out of the complaints, wandered around the compound, holding her phone up high, desperately searching for a signal. "No Instagram, no Snap, no TikTok," she said, almost as if speaking to the universe. "Are we even still in this country?" Her voice carried across the compound, mocking the isolation they had landed in. But despite the grumbling, despite the discomfort, Richard's gaze remained fixed on the fire, the small flickers of light offering a faint glimmer of hope in the dark. That night, they all slept in the same room, the air thick with the sound of mosquitoes buzzing and the smell of damp earth. The small mattress Richard had rolled out on the floor felt harder than anything he'd ever slept on before. The lantern beside them flickered, casting an eerie, dim glow across the room, its light struggling against the dark. Grace lay on her side, slapping her arms in frustration, cursing under her breath every time her skin was pricked by a mosquito. Her hair was messy, her makeup long gone, and the once polished woman had now become a figure of exhaustion and irritation. "I can't do this," she muttered, turning restlessly in the cramped space. "This is beneath me." Sophia tossed and turned beside her, her body constantly shifting, unable to find a comfortable position on the hard floor. The faint rustling of her movements mixed with the distant sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside. She whimpered softly, her face scrunched up in distaste. "I hate this place," she groaned, running a hand through her unkempt hair. "How are we supposed to live here? There's no Wi-Fi, no mirrors, no nothing. This is insane." Richard lay still, staring up at the thatched roof above them, his thoughts racing in the silence of the room. The weight of everything, losing his fortune, the betrayal of his family, the isolation of this place, pressed down on him. But through it all, one voice stood out. Daniel's voice, soft and steady, broke through the noise in Richard's mind. "Dad," Daniel whispered from beside him. Richard turned his head slightly, meeting his son's eyes in the darkness. Daniel's hand gently tapped his shoulder, the touch offering more comfort than any words could. "Don't worry. I know this is hard, but we'll make it. We'll be fine." Richard's heart swelled with gratitude, a single tear slipping from his eye before he wiped it away. For the first time in years, he felt a connection, real and unbroken, with someone who truly understood him. The world outside may have turned its back on him, but in that moment, with his son beside him, he knew they could survive anything. Together, they would rebuild. The next morning, the rooster's crow pierced through the stillness, cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over the small house. Grace jerked awake, her face scrunched in irritation. "What kind of nonsense bird is that?" she shouted, her voice harsh and groggy from the lack of sleep. Richard stretched slowly, unfazed by the early morning chaos, and stood up, his muscles stiff from sleeping on the hard floor. The sun was already beginning to rise, casting a pale light through the small window, but there was no warmth to it, only the cold reality of the new life they had been forced into. "It's morning," Richard said quietly, his tone calm but firm. "Time to start our new life." Sophia, her face a picture of exhaustion and frustration, stumbled out of the room. Her hair was a tangled mess, her skin dotted with mosquito bites, and her clothes hung loosely on her, as if she were a different person entirely from the confident city girl she once was. She looked around, her eyes filled with distaste. "I can't do this," she whined, clutching her stomach as if it ached from the very thought of being in this place. "I need to go back to the city. I'm feeling sick." Richard ignored her, his attention focused on the small garden plot behind the house. He picked up a hoe and looked at Daniel, who had already risen, his expression determined. "We need to start farming if we're going to eat," Richard said, his voice steady despite the weight of their situation. "We must work." Grace's laugh cut through the morning air like a knife. "Farm?" she scoffed, her hands on her hips, as if the very idea was beneath her. "You want me, Grace, to work the land? God forbid!" Sophia folded her arms defiantly. "Not happening. I'd rather die," she added bitterly. Daniel, however, moved forward without hesitation. He reached for the hoe from his father's hands, his grip steady. "Let's go, Dad," he said, his voice calm but filled with resolve. "I'll help." Richard looked at his son, pride swelling in his chest. "Thank you, Daniel. You're the only one who makes this easier for me," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Together, father and son walked toward the field, the sun rising higher above them, casting a long shadow across the hard, dry earth. Despite the hardships, Richard found a flicker of hope in this small, silent moment. They were together, and that was enough. Days passed, and life in the village became an unbearable routine for Grace and Sophia. The oppressive heat during the day, the lack of amenities, and the endless chores that seemed to stretch on without end wore them both down. Grace sat beneath the shade of a mango tree, fanning herself with a palm leaf, her eyes full of frustration as she stared at the barren land around her. "This is not life," she muttered under her breath. "This is punishment." Her skin had grown darker from the sun, and the glossy, well-kept appearance she once had was now replaced by a roughness that mirrored the harshness of her environment. Sophia, still wearing the remnants of her city life, clutched a small bucket, her slippers mismatched as she trudged across the compound to fetch water from the village well. Her makeup had long since washed away, and her once perfectly styled hair now hung in tangled strands. "Mom," she whispered, her voice soft but full of despair. "We need to do something. I can't live like this much longer. My skin is becoming dark." Grace's eyes lit up as she saw the familiar figure of the village chief, Morgan, walking toward them. He was dressed in expensive native wear, gold chains glinting around his neck as he moved with the confidence of someone who had power and influence. The two young girls trailing behind him, giggling as they followed him like shadows, only added to his imposing presence. Grace's mind immediately began to calculate the possibilities. "That's the chief," she said to Sophia, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He looks rich." Sophia eyed him cautiously. "Is that how chiefs look around here?" she muttered, her voice tinged with skepticism. Grace stood up, adjusting her wrapper and smoothing out the wrinkles. "Let me go and greet him," she said, a plan already forming in her mind. She walked toward the chief with a practiced sway in her hips, her steps deliberate as she pretended to limp slightly, aiming to appear more fragile. "Good morning, sir," she greeted, bowing slightly as she approached him. Chief Morgan gave her a wide, predatory smile. "Well, well, who do we have here?" "You're not from this village," he said, his voice smooth, as though he had already sized her up. Grace smiled sweetly, leaning in closer. "No, I'm not. We just moved here. My husband, Richard, brought me and my children after we lost everything in the city. It's been so hard." The chief chuckled, clearly enjoying her company. "A fine woman like you shouldn't be suffering," he said, waving toward one of the girls to bring her a drink. Grace sat beside him, smiling, her mind already scheming. "You're too kind," she replied. As Richard and Daniel worked under the scorching sun, their bodies covered in sweat, the contrast couldn't have been clearer. The two of them, toiling in the heat for their survival, while Grace sipped a cold drink, her laughter blending with the sound of the village breeze.